So let's take a look at our first example. We're going to look at a painting by Piet Mondrian, and we are going to code it with CSS Grid. So Piet Mondrian was a painter in the 1930s. You are probably familiar with his work. It's very popular. Here's Yves Saint Laurent, who turned it into dresses in the 1960s, but it was originally a painting. So let's take a look at that now. Now, obviously, laying out a painting is a pretty limited type of exercise. We're just going to work with big squares of color and lay them out here on this web page accordingly. And we're going to wind up using some absolute measures of measurement. We're going to work with a lot of pixels in this particular design. I find that students like this exercise as an introduction to grid because everything is very clear and concise and compact, and we know exactly what it is that we're building. And so this is a great way to start getting familiar with the thinking that goes into CSS Grid. Our HTML is very simple. We just have a series of divs here because we have absolutely no meaning in this document whatsoever. There's no need to use any type of more interesting HTML. So we have a div with a class of wrapper. Inside of that, we have 7 divs, and they have letters that are associated with them. And that's pretty easy HTML to remember, so I'm just going to make my CSS window here a little bit bigger inside of our code pen. Once again, those are available from the course website. If you take a look at the Mondrian painting exercises, there's a link to the code pen right from that page. Inside of this, you'll see that I've given you a little bit of starting code. Here's our wrapper. I set a width and a height on it because, again, this is a painting. We want it to look in a very specific kind of way. In the real world, I would not recommend setting a width and a height necessarily on your grid, definitely not a height. Width, maybe not. And I've given this background image to you. So this is the painting that we are going to be coding. And I've put in letters for all of the cells that we're going to be working with. So you can see exactly where we want all of these boxes to wind up happening. So the little letters that you see on the top here in the rows, that's our code. And then the bigger boxes that are behind this, that is the painting. So you see here, I've given you a little bit of starting code. In the divs, every div has got a border on it, a color of white, and 50% opacity so that we can see both our cells and the painting behind, along with sort of a basic font. So let's go ahead and get started with this. And as I told you, the syntax we want to think about is grid row and grid column. We're going to specify this for each one of these cells inside of this particular exercise. So let's start with letter A. What is going to be our grid row and our grid column values here for letter A? Well, probably the best place to start is to think about how many rows and how many columns we're going to work with in the first place. So if we look at the painting here, you'll see that we have one row here with letter A, one row here with letter B, and then down here at the bottom, we've actually got 2 more rows, one for letter F and one for letter G. So we have 4 rows. And then how many columns do we have? It looks like 3 columns going across. So 3 columns, 4 rows. So for letter A then, how many columns and how many rows is it going to take up? It's going to occupy probably 1 column, and it's going to occupy 1 row. Which one? Now we have to count. So from here, we start, remember, our first line is just outside of the drawing here. So there's line number 1. Line number 2 is going to be this one here between A and C. Line number 3 is going to be way over here between E and F. And line number 4 is all the way on the outside. Likewise, in the rows, we have our first line up here before the painting starts. That's line 1. Line 2 is between A and B. And line 3 is going to be between B and D. Line 4 is outside of the painting. So for letter A, what is our position here for this? We're going to have a grid row of 1/2, right? We're going to have it go from 1 to 2. And we're going to have our grid column going from 1 to 2 as well. And I forgot to do something. Did anyone catch? I've started to declare what the children are going to do without declaring what the parent needs to do, haven't I? All right, so let's go back and put that in place. Here on this, this outside div on the wrapper itself, let's go ahead and add to this a display grid. There we go. And we're just going to leave it at that for the moment. We can specify a grid gap if you want. Grid gap. Oops, sorry. Gap. I have to remember that the new syntax is just plain gap, so hopefully I won't make that mistake too many times. It's just plain gap, no longer grid gap. And the values here can be 30 pixels, 20 pixels. And so that'll give us some space both horizontally and vertically once we start to specify all of the rest of our values here. Now we haven't told Grid how many columns and how many rows we're ultimately going to have. So Grid's doing the best it can with the information it has, which is it's just going to drop one cell, basically all in a column just like this by default, until we start specifying where all of our individual cells go. So it's totally right here with A. It's going from row 1 to 2, exactly as we'd expect, and Grid doesn't know that we have more columns in mind, so it's stretched this all the way across the painting. Let's go to letter B here then. What are going to be our values here for grid row and grid column?
1/2. 1/3.
1/2 and 1/3. Okay? So 1/2 for which one? The row or the column?
Row.
Row, 1/2. And the column would be 1/3?
There's a few people saying 2/3.
Okay. So take a look at what's happening here. We said our grid row, look at A and B. Grid row is exactly the same. And check out what's happening here in our display. So this is one of the really important grid properties that is not true of Flexbox. Grid cells can occupy the same space. So here, based on what we've said in the chat, we have A and B occupying exactly the same row. And they are, in fact, occupying the same row. They are on top of each other. This is a very cool effect. We're going to talk a lot more about it later, but it's not what we want here. So what would be a better value then for grid row? Okay.
2/3.
2/3. All right. 2/3. There we go. So yeah, now that's going to move this down a little bit more. Okay. And then how about the column? So here we said 1/3. It's doing exactly what you'd expect. It's in our second row, but now it's pushing across 2 columns, and C moved up here to the top. And that's actually what you would expect. C is going to try to occupy the space that B might have otherwise left behind. That is the way grid is going to work. So C pops on up here. But that's not exactly the layout that we're looking for. So what would be a better value for grid column for letter B?
2/3.
2/3. Okay. So if we said 2/3, okay, so when A is now here in the upper left, but B is down here in the lower right. That's remember this is 2 to 3. We actually want B to show up over here, starting at line number 1, going to line number 2. So let's change that to 1/2. All right, so we are back now to what grid thinks is a single column, and that's okay. Because when we put in letter C, grid will know that we actually have more than one column working here. We have A and B in the same column, but they are in different rows. All right, so here for letter C then, and a grid column. Okay, so now we have letter C, as you can see here. It is spanning across some particular area. So it's definitely going from line 1 to line 2 to line 3. That's our rows. Okay, so our grid row here is going to be 1/3. Nice. And then it automatically fills in the space that's over here. So now grid knows that we have 2 columns, kind of. So it's going ahead and drawing that in this particular space here. Our grid column, though, anybody want to take a suggestion as to what our numbers are for our grid column?
1/2.
1/2 for the column. Remember, we start here. Here's line 1 for our column. Here's line 2. We actually want it over here, don't we? Any other suggestions?
2/4.
2/4. That's correct. Because we're going to go from 2. Remember, we're going to have a line here. It's this part down here between E and F. Well, it's line 2, line 3, and then line 4 is outside of the painting.